The scorching Sahel wind carried dust through the corridors of the presidential palace in Ouagadougou as Captain Ibrahim Traoré reviewed the encrypted message that had arrived at dawn. The request was unprecedented. A private, off-the-record meeting with the former American president. No diplomatic protocols, no official delegations. Through the window, he could see the red earth of Burkina Faso stretching endlessly, a reminder of the sovereignty he had fought to protect. His aide knocked softly, whispering that the American delegation had arrived earlier than expected. The young leader's jaw tightened as he folded the message. This wasn't about trade deals or military cooperation. Something deeper was at stake, something that made powerful men cross oceans in secrecy. The meeting room fell silent as two worlds collided, the calculated confidence of Western power meeting the quiet strength of African determination. Trump's usual bravado seemed muted in the presence of Traoré's unwavering gaze, the kind that had stared down French colonial interests and emerged victorious. The camera crew, hand-picked for discretion, positioned themselves strategically around the room, their equipment humming softly. Traoré gestured to the traditional Burkinabe chairs, a subtle reminder that this was African soil, governed by African rules. The translator stood ready, though both men spoke enough English for direct communication. The air conditioning struggled against the afternoon heat, creating an atmosphere thick with tension and unspoken questions. As they settled into their seats, Traoré placed a leather portfolio on the mahogany table between them, its contents hidden but its significance unmistakable. Trump's eyes darted to the folder, then back to his host's face, searching for clues about what had prompted this extraordinary gathering. The younger man's reputation for meticulous research was well known. He didn't make moves without concrete evidence. Outside, the call to prayer echoed from nearby mosques, a reminder of the spiritual foundation that guided Traoré's leadership. The cameras rolled silently, capturing every micro-expression, every shift in body language. This wasn't just a diplomatic meeting. It was a moment that would reshape how power was understood between continents. Traoré opened the portfolio with deliberate slowness, his fingers tracing documents that seemed to hold the weight of history. "Mr. Trump," he began, his accented English carrying the authority of someone who had never bent to foreign pressure. "What I'm about to share will challenge everything you think you know about your own family's story." The American leaned forward, his usual confident demeanor giving way to something resembling concern. The camera operators exchanged glances, sensing that they were about to witness something extraordinary. In the distance, children's laughter drifted from the palace courtyard, a stark contrast to the gravity building inside the room. The truth that was about to unfold would bridge centuries, connecting the red soil of Africa to the marble halls of American power in ways neither man could have anticipated. The leather portfolio creaked as Traoré withdrew a yellowed document, its edges worn by time and careful handling. The parchment bore the seal of a French colonial administrator from 1847, alongside symbols that predated European arrival by centuries. Trump squinted at the faded ink, recognizing some English words scattered among French colonial script and indigenous markings. The document's provenance was undeniable. Watermarks, aged fibers, and authentication stamps confirmed its legitimacy. Traoré's research team had discovered it in the archives of Bobo Dioulasso, buried beneath decades of colonial bureaucracy. The young captain's voice remained steady as he explained how traditional griots had preserved oral histories that corroborated the written evidence. This wasn't just paper and ink. It was a bridge between worlds that colonialism had tried to sever. The second document emerged from the portfolio like a revelation waiting decades to surface, bearing DNA analysis reports from 3 separate laboratories. Trump's breathing grew shallow as he recognized the genetic markers highlighted in fluorescent yellow, connecting bloodlines across continents and centuries. The scientific data was irrefutable. Mitochondrial DNA sequences that traced maternal lineages back to the mossy kingdoms of present-day Burkina Faso. Traoré had commissioned the analysis after oral traditions in his own village spoke of ancestors who had vanished during the slave trade's peak. The laboratory report showed probability percentages that made denial impossible, genetic fingerprints that survived the Middle Passage's brutal journey. Each page turned revealed another layer of connection, another thread in a tapestry that colonialism had tried to destroy. The truth was written in chromosomes and preserved in the collective memory of African communities. The room's temperature seemed to drop as Trump absorbed the implications, his usual confident posture crumbling under the weight of undeniable evidence. Traoré watched the American's face cycle through disbelief, recognition, and something approaching panic as the genetic connections became clear. The cameras continued rolling, capturing every moment of this unprecedented revelation that challenged centuries of carefully constructed narratives. Outside, the evening call to prayer began, its haunting melody providing a soundtrack to this moment of reckoning. The colonial administrator's records detailed forced relocations, families torn apart, and identities deliberately erased to facilitate the slave trade. Trump's hands trembled slightly as he reached for the water glass, his throat dry with the realization of what this meant. The truth that African communities had preserved through oral tradition was now validated by modern science. The final document in the portfolio bore the most devastating revelation, a ship's manifest from 1847 listing passengers transported to American plantations. Among the entries, written in careful colonial script, was a name that made Trump's face drain of color completely. The record showed a young woman from the Mossy people, bearing genetic markers identical to those in his own DNA profile. Traoré's voice remained calm as he explained how his grandmother's stories had led him to investigate these connections years before becoming president. The manifest included detailed physical descriptions and tribal affiliations that matched Trump's genetic analysis with stunning precision. The slave ship had carried human cargo to Virginia plantations, where forced breeding programs had mixed bloodlines for economic purposes. This wasn't just about ancestry. It was about the brutal reality of how American fortunes were built on African bodies. The camera crew sensed the magnitude of what they were witnessing, their equipment capturing a moment that would redefine historical narratives forever. The laboratory report spread across the mahogany table like an indictment written in genetic code, each page reinforcing what oral tradition had preserved for generations. Dr. Aminata Sawadogo's signature appeared on the bottom of every analysis, her credentials from the University of Ouagadougou lending academic weight to findings that challenged American mythology. The mitochondrial DNA sequences showed 99.7% probability of shared ancestry between Trump's maternal line and the Mossy people of central Burkina Faso. Traoré pointed to specific genetic markers that appeared in both samples, his finger tracing the scientific proof of connections that slavery had tried to erase. The haplogroup classifications were unmistakable. L2A1C, a genetic signature found predominantly in West African populations and their diaspora descendants. Trump stared at the chromosomal maps as if willing them to change, but science doesn't bend to political convenience. The evidence was as solid as the red earth beneath the palace foundations. The second set of tests had been conducted independently at laboratories in Accra and Dakar, their results corroborating the Ouagadougou findings with devastating precision. Each analysis revealed the same genetic story. Trump carried African maternal DNA that traced directly to the region Traoré now governed. The autosomal DNA comparison showed shared segments that indicated common ancestry within the past 250 years, perfectly aligning with historical records of the Atlantic slave trade. Traore had insisted on multiple laboratories to prevent any claims of manipulation or bias in the results. The genetic genealogy report included detailed family trees constructed from DNA matches, showing branches that connected Virginia plantations to Burkina Faso villages. Trump's usual bluster was nowhere to be found, as he confronted irrefutable scientific proof of his African heritage. The cameras captured every moment of his stunned silence, documenting the crumbling of carefully constructed racial narratives. The most damning evidence lay in the comparative analysis between Trump's DNA and samples from the Mossi royal lineages, preserved in Traore's own family records. The genetic distance calculations showed a closer relationship than many people share with their known cousins, indicating direct descent rather than distant tribal connections. Traoré explained how his grandmother had insisted on preserving hair samples and personal items from ancestors who had disappeared during colonial raids. Modern DNA extraction techniques had made it possible to analyze these century-old biological materials and establish precise genealogical connections. The laboratory had even identified specific genetic variants associated with resistance to malaria, adaptations that evolved in West African populations over millennia. Trump's complexion seemed to pale further as he realized his body carried genetic gifts from the continent he had publicly disparaged. The scientific evidence painted a picture that no amount of political spin could alter. Traoré leaned forward, his voice carrying the weight of ancestral authority as he delivered the final genetic revelation that would shatter decades of carefully crafted identity. The Y chromosome analysis had revealed something even more shocking. Trump's paternal line also carried markers suggesting mixed ancestry from earlier generations of colonial contact. The laboratory had traced specific genetic variants that indicated his great-great-grandmother had been a woman of mixed African and European heritage, likely born on a plantation in the antebellum South. DNA doesn't lie about bloodlines, and the evidence showed generations of suppressed African ancestry that had been deliberately hidden from family histories. Trump's hands shook as he processed the implications. His entire political brand had been built on racial divisions that his own genetics contradicted. The cameras continued rolling as 47 seconds ticked by, capturing the moment when scientific truth collided with political mythology. This wasn't just about one man's ancestry, it was about the lies America had told itself about race, blood, and belonging for centuries. Traoré glanced at his Swiss timepiece, a gift from his father who had worked 3 jobs to afford it, and began the calculated revelation that would alter history forever. Mr. Trump, you have exactly 47 seconds before this information becomes public knowledge, he announced, with the precision of a military commander executing a perfectly timed operation. The American's eyes widened as he processed the ultimatum, realizing this wasn't a negotiation, but a reckoning that had been years in the making. Outside, the evening muezzin's call echoed across Ouagadougou, marking the transition from day to night as the world prepared to shift on its axis. The camera operators instinctively adjusted their focus, sensing that something monumental was about to unfold in real time. Trump's breathing became visibly labored as the countdown began, each second stretching like an eternity under the weight of impending exposure. Traoré's voice remained steady, a testament to the composure that had helped him navigate coups and international pressure with unwavering resolve. The digital clock on the wall displayed 1842-13 as Traoré continued his methodical dismantling of decades of carefully constructed mythology about American racial superiority. 37 seconds, mister. Trump, before the DNA results are simultaneously released to Al Jazeera, BBC Africa, and France 24, he stated. his tone carrying the inevitability of justice long delayed. Trump's usual bravado crumbled as he realized the global implications. His political brand, built on division, would collapse under the weight of scientific truth. The air conditioning hummed steadily, but sweat beaded on the American's forehead as African heat and overwhelming revelation combined to break his composure. Traore had calculated this moment precisely, knowing that public exposure would carry more weight than private confrontation. The cameras captured every micro-expression, every shift in Trump's body language as the reality of his situation crystallized. 27 seconds remained before the truth would be beyond anyone's control. The countdown continued with mechanical precision as Trump's mind raced through possible responses, damage control strategies, and desperate bargaining positions that would never materialize. 17 seconds, and your African ancestry becomes global knowledge, connecting you forever to the continent you've spent decades disparaging, Traore announced, his words cutting through the artificial cool of the presidential office. The former American president's hands gripped the chair arms as if anchoring himself against a hurricane of revelation that threatened to destroy his carefully crafted identity. Outside, children played in the palace courtyard, their laughter a stark contrast to the tense silence inside the meeting room. The DNA evidence lay spread across the table like an indictment written in genetic code, impossible to dispute or spin. Cameras rolled silently, documenting the precise moment when scientific truth collided with political mythology. 7 seconds remained before the world would learn that one of America's most divisive figures carried the blood of the people he had maligned. The final countdown began as Traore's phone displayed the prepared press release, his thumb hovering over the send button that would distribute the revelation to newsrooms across 3 continents simultaneously. 3, 2, 1... The captain's voice carried the weight of ancestral justice as Trump's face transformed from defiance to panic, his usual confidence evaporating like morning dew in the Sahel sun. The moment stretched between heartbeats as power dynamics shifted irreversibly, the colonizer's descendant forced to confront his own African heritage in the land of his ancestors. Trump's mouth opened and closed soundlessly, his brain struggling to process the implications of public exposure that would redefine his legacy forever. The cameras captured it all, the exact moment when carefully constructed racial narratives collapsed under the weight of undeniable scientific truth. Outside, the evening call to prayer reached its crescendo, as if the very heavens were bearing witness to this reckoning. History would mark this as the precise moment when the lies of centuries finally met their match, in the form of a young African leader who refused to let truth remain buried. "Wait!" The word exploded from Trump's lips with a desperation that stripped away decades of carefully cultivated authority, his voice cracking like a teenager's under the weight of impending humiliation. His hands reached across the mahogany table toward Traore, fingers trembling as they grasped for mercy from the man whose continent he had publicly scorned. The cameras captured every moment of his collapse, the beads of sweat multiplying on his forehead, the slight tremor in his lower lip, the way his shoulders sagged under ancestral truth. "Please, Captain, we can work something out," he whispered, his usual bombast replaced by the pleading tone of someone watching their empire crumble in real time. The air conditioning seemed to mock his discomfort, unable to cool the heat of revelation that burned through his manufactured confidence. Traore remained motionless, his dark eyes reflecting generations of dignity that colonialism had never managed to break. The power dynamic had shifted so completely that the room itself seemed to acknowledge Africa's ascendancy over Western arrogance. Trump's voice dropped to barely above a whisper as he abandoned all pretense of negotiating from strength, his political instincts finally recognizing a battle that couldn't be won through bluster or intimidation. "Cut the cameras, please, I'm begging you," he said, his eyes darting frantically between the silent operators and their unforgiving lenses that continued to document his humiliation. The man who had built a career on projecting invincibility was now pleading with the dignity of someone whose deepest secrets had been exposed by science itself. His hands shook as he reached for his water glass, the simple act of hydration becoming a struggle under the weight of genetic truth. The childhood nickname Donnie seemed more appropriate now than the titles he had accumulated through decades of political maneuvering. Traoré watched this breakdown with the patience of someone who had endured French bombs and military coups without flinching. The cameras continued their relentless documentation, capturing vulnerability that no amount of wealth or power could shield. "I'll do anything," Trump continued, his voice breaking completely as the reality of global exposure settled into his consciousness like a cancer that would metastasize through every aspect of his carefully constructed identity. The admission hung in the air like incense from a nearby mosque, carrying with it the weight of complete surrender to forces beyond his control. His usual tendency to dominate conversations had been replaced by stammering attempts to find words that might somehow undo scientific fact. The portfolio of DNA evidence lay open between them like a genetic indictment that no legal team could dismiss or spin into acceptable narrative. Trump's eyes filled with something approaching panic as he realized his African heritage would become headline news across every continent within hours. The red earth of Burkina Faso seemed to mock him through the window, a reminder that this land had birthed his ancestors before slavery scattered them across the Atlantic. Even his breathing had become labored, as if the truth itself was suffocating the lies he had lived his entire life. The final plea emerged as a broken whisper that barely registered above the humming air conditioning, Trump's legendary ego finally meeting a reality it couldn't bend or break through force of will. "My legacy, my family, everything I've built will be destroyed," he gasped, his hands pressed against the table as if the mahogany could somehow anchor him against the hurricane of revelation. The cameras zoomed in automatically, their operators trained to capture moments of historical significance, regardless of personal discomfort with the scene unfolding. Traoré's silence spoke louder than any response could have, his stillness a reminder that justice delayed is not justice denied when truth finally surfaces. The DNA evidence lay spread between them, like the remnants of a mythology that science had systematically destroyed, chromosome by chromosome. Trump's breathing became increasingly shallow as he contemplated the global implications of his African ancestry becoming public knowledge. The sound of children playing in the courtyard drifted through the windows, their innocent laughter a stark contrast to the adult reckoning happening inside these walls. In that moment, the man who had built an empire on racial division was reduced to begging an African leader for mercy he had never shown to others. The lead cameraman, Jean-Baptiste Ouedraogo, felt his hands tighten involuntarily around his equipment as he witnessed the most powerful moment of his 20-year career unfolding through his viewfinder. His training at the Institut Supérieur de l'Image et du Son had never prepared him for documenting the complete psychological breakdown of a former world leader. The red recording light blinked steadily, a mechanical heartbeat marking each second of Trump's humiliation as history wrote itself in real time. His assistant Fatima exchanged meaningful glances with the sound engineer, all three recognizing that they held footage that would reshape global political narratives forever. The weight of their responsibility pressed down like the Sahel heat. They weren't just documenting a meeting, but capturing evidence of truth that powerful interests would kill to suppress. Jean-Baptiste's finger hovered over the pause button, his conscience wrestling with professional duty as Trump's pleas echoed through the presidential office. The ethical implications of continuing to film a man's complete psychological collapse challenged every principle of journalistic integrity he had learned. Fatima adjusted her audio levels as Trump's voice dropped to desperate whispers, her headphones capturing every nuance of his breakdown with crystal clarity that would make denial impossible. The boom microphone trembled slightly in her grip, not from technical inadequacy, but from the moral weight of preserving Trump's humiliation for posterity and global consumption. Her journalism degree from the University of Ouagadougou had emphasized the sacred duty of truth-telling, but watching a human being disintegrate under genetic revelation felt like voyeurism disguised as documentation. The sound waves she captured carried more than words. They preserved the exact moment when carefully constructed racial mythologies crumbled under scientific evidence. Her equipment registered every labored breath, every stammered plea, every crack in Trump's voice as his legendary confidence evaporated like morning dew. The technical precision of her work contrasted sharply with the human drama she was duty-bound to preserve, despite her growing discomfort. Professional obligation warred with human empathy as she continued recording what felt like a public execution by DNA evidence. The camera operators moved with the practiced synchronization of a surgical team, their equipment capturing multiple angles of Trump's collapse while maintaining the professional distance that their training demanded. Jean-Baptiste's wide-angle lens encompassed the full scene. The DNA evidence spread across the table, Traoré's unwavering composure, and Trump's complete transformation from arrogant politician to broken supplicant. The zoom function brought every detail into sharp focus, the sweat beading on pale skin, the trembling hands, the eyes that darted desperately between escape routes that didn't exist. His years documenting political upheavals in West Africa had never prepared him for witnessing the psychological destruction of someone who had once held nuclear codes. The steady whir of cooling fans provided a mechanical soundtrack to organic human breakdown, creating an unsettling contrast between technological precision and emotional chaos. Each frame captured told a story that would be analyzed by historians, psychologists, and political scientists for generations to come. The burden of preserving truth felt heavier with each passing second as Trump's dignity dissolved completely. The crew exchanged silent signals as they grappled with an unprecedented ethical dilemma. Continue documenting history or show mercy to a man whose worldview was collapsing in real time before their lenses. Jean-Baptiste remembered his grandfather's stories about French colonial officers who had broken down similarly when confronted with African resistance, their superiority complexes crumbling under indigenous strength. The parallel wasn't lost on him as he watched another representative of Western supremacy face the reality of African truth and dignity. His equipment captured not just Trump's individual breakdown, but the symbolic collapse of centuries of racial mythology that had justified slavery, colonialism, and ongoing exploitation. The red recording light continued blinking, each pulse marking another second of evidence that would survive long after everyone in this room had returned to dust. Fatima's audio equipment preserved Trump's desperate breathing, the sound of a man drowning in genetic truth that he could neither escape nor deny. They were no longer just camera operators. They had become the chroniclers of a moment when the lies of history finally met their match in the form of science and African dignity that refused to remain silent. Traoré's voice cut through Trump's desperate pleas with the precision of a surgeon exposing infected tissue, each word carrying the weight of ancestral vindication that had waited centuries for this moment. Your great-great-grandmother, Amara Kabore, was taken from this very region in 1847 aboard the merchant vessel Liberty's Promise, a name that mocked the freedom it stole from African soil. The irony wasn't lost on anyone in the room, as the DNA evidence painted a picture of forced migration that connected Trump's bloodline directly to the red earth beneath their feet. The ship's manifest detailed how 17-year-old Amara had been sold to Virginia plantation owners who specialized in breeding programs designed to maximize human chattel profits. Trump's face drained of all color as Traore explained how oral traditions in his own village had preserved Amara's memory for 5 generations. Her story passed down through griots who refused to let colonial violence erase African identity. The genetic markers didn't lie. Trump carried mitochondrial DNA that traced directly to the Mossy Kingdoms, making him a literal descendant of the people he had spent decades dehumanizing. The cameras captured every moment of this revelation, documenting the precise instant when American racial mythology collided with African genetic truth. The laboratory analysis revealed that Trump's African ancestry wasn't distant or diluted. It was direct, recent, and undeniable, making his white supremacist rhetoric a form of genetic self-hatred that psychiatrists would study for decades. Dr. Sawadogo's research had traced the maternal lineage through 5 generations of careful breeding records maintained by plantation owners who treated human reproduction like livestock management. The DNA comparison showed that Trump shared more genetic material with Traoré's own family than with many of his supposed European relatives, a biological irony that redefined everything he thought he knew about racial purity. The haplogroup L2A1C appeared in both men's genetic profiles, indicating common ancestry within the past 200 years and connecting 2 leaders across continents through blood that slavery had tried to dilute. Trump's hands trembled as he absorbed the implications. His political career had been built on dividing people who were literally his genetic family. The mitochondrial evidence was particularly damning because it traced maternal lineage with mathematical precision, proving that his great-great-grandmother's African identity had been passed down through generations of women who had hidden their heritage to survive. The scientific data showed that approximately 12% of Trump's autosomal DNA originated from West African populations, a percentage that made him more genetically African than many people who proudly claimed the continent as their ancestral home. The genealogical records painted a devastating picture of how American plantation society had systematically erased African identities while exploiting African bodies for economic gain across multiple generations. Amara Traoré had given birth to 7 children on the Meadowbrook plantation in Virginia, each bearing the mixed heritage that slavery had created through systematic rape and forced breeding programs. The plantation ledgers, preserved in Virginia Historical Society archives, documented how her descendants had been deliberately separated and sold to different owners to prevent family bonds from threatening the institution of slavery. Trump's direct ancestor, listed as Amara's daughter Sarah, had eventually gained freedom during Reconstruction, but had been forced to pass as white to protect herself and her children from post-war racial violence. The genetic evidence showed how 5 generations of women had carried African DNA while living as white Americans, their true heritage buried beneath layers of survival strategies and social necessity. Traoré explained how his grandmother's oral histories had preserved Amara's Mossy name, her tribal affiliations, and even specific songs that she had sung to her children before slavery stole her voice forever. The DNA analysis confirmed that these oral traditions were scientifically accurate, proving that African communities had maintained historical records with greater precision than official colonial documentation. The final genetic revelations struck like lightning, illuminating the grotesque irony of Trump's entire political identity being built on hatred for his own ancestral people and their descendants. The Y chromosome analysis revealed that even his paternal line carried evidence of African ancestry from earlier colonial mixing, making his white supremacist ideology a form of internalized racism that targeted his own genetic heritage. Laboratory testing had identified specific genetic variants associated with West African populations in both his maternal and paternal lineages, indicating that multiple branches of his family tree were rooted in African soil. The probability calculations were mathematically devastating, 99.7% certainty that his maternal great-great-grandmother was of pure Mossi ancestry, with additional evidence suggesting mixed African heritage on his father's side dating back to early colonial Virginia. Trump's breathing became increasingly labored as he processed the reality that his entire racial worldview was based on lies that his own DNA contradicted with scientific certainty. The cameras continued rolling as he confronted the truth that he was genetically closer to the African migrants he had demonized than to the European ancestors he had claimed as the source of his superiority. In that moment, the red earth of Burkina Faso seemed to reclaim one of its scattered children, bringing Trump face to face with ancestral truth that no amount of political power could ever alter or deny. The revelation ricocheted across continents like a seismic wave, fundamentally altering the geopolitical landscape as newsrooms from Lagos to London scrambled to process the implications of Trump's African ancestry. Within hours, the footage would transform how the world understood American racial mythology, revealing the hollow foundation upon which centuries of white supremacist ideology had been constructed. Traoré's calculated exposure represented more than personal vindication. It was Africa's intellectual and moral victory over Western narratives that had justified slavery, colonialism, and ongoing economic exploitation. The DNA evidence would force every international leader to reconsider their assumptions about race, power, and the artificial hierarchies that had shaped global politics since the Atlantic slave trade began. European capitals would scramble to distance themselves from American racial rhetoric that now appeared scientifically absurd, while African nations would gain unprecedented moral authority in international forums. The cameras captured not just Trump's breakdown, but the precise moment when the global South's intellectual sovereignty asserted itself over northern arrogance with irrefutable scientific proof. China, Russia, and other powers would immediately recognize the propaganda value of America's most vocal white supremacist being exposed as genetically African. The economic implications would reshape international trade relationships as African nations leveraged this revelation to demand reparations and fair partnerships from Western powers built on stolen African labor. Trump's business empire, constructed on a brand of white authority, would collapse as consumers worldwide recognized the grotesque irony of an African descendant profiting from anti-African sentiment. Stock markets would fluctuate wildly as investors processed how this genetic bombshell would affect American soft power and international credibility in diplomatic negotiations. The revelation would empower indigenous movements globally, proving that colonialism's racial categories were scientific fiction, designed to justify economic exploitation rather than biological reality. African governments would cite this case in international courts, demonstrating how genetic evidence could support reparations claims for historical injustices that continued to shape global inequality. Traoré's strategic timing ensured maximum global impact, releasing the information during African Union meetings, where continental leaders could immediately capitalize on America's racial mythology being exposed as fraudulent. The global power balance would shift as Africa's moral authority rose, while America's credibility crumbled under the weight of its own contradictions. International law would be forever changed, as this case established genetic evidence as legitimate proof of historical connections that could support indigenous land claims and reparations lawsuits worldwide. The United Nations would face pressure to revise its approach to racial issues, forced to acknowledge that American leadership on human rights had been compromised by leaders who didn't even understand their own genetic heritage. European museums would confront new pressure to return African artifacts, unable to maintain colonial theft, was justified when their closest allies were revealed to be African descendants themselves. The revelation would inspire liberation movements across the global South, proving that colonialism's racial hierarchies were built on lies that science could systematically destroy. Academic institutions worldwide would scramble to revise curricula that had perpetuated racial myths now exposed as genetically impossible, while medical research would gain new insights into human migration patterns. Social media would explode with memes and commentary about the irony of America's most prominent racist being proven African, fundamentally altering how younger generations understood race and identity. The footage would become required viewing in schools across Africa, Asia, and Latin America, teaching children that Western racial superiority was always a lie waiting to be exposed. The diplomatic reverberations would echo through every international relationship America had cultivated, based on racial solidarity with other white-majority nations, forcing complete recalibration of alliances built on shared supremacist assumptions. African leaders would demand seats at tables previously reserved for Western powers, using Trump's genetic African identity as proof that racial categories used to exclude the continent were scientifically meaningless. The revelation would strengthen South-South cooperation as nations recognized how genetic evidence could undermine Northern claims to racial and intellectual superiority that justified ongoing economic exploitation. International development organizations would face pressure to restructure aid relationships, unable to maintain paternalistic approaches when their funders were revealed to have African ancestry they had systematically denied. The footage would inspire new scholarship, examining how many other Western leaders might carry hidden African heritage, threatening to unravel centuries of carefully constructed racial narratives that supported global inequality. Climate change negotiations would shift as African nations gained moral authority to demand reparations from countries whose leaders were exposed as genetic hypocrites, denying their own continental heritage. The moment would mark the beginning of Africa's intellectual renaissance, as the continent's traditional knowledge systems gained international recognition for preserving genetic truths that Western science was only beginning to rediscover through modern DNA analysis. Trump's desperation exploded into frantic action as he reached for his encrypted phone, fingers trembling while dialing numbers that connected him to the shadowy network of fixers who had buried scandals for decades. "We need immediate damage control. Kill this story before it breathes," he whispered urgently into the device, his voice carrying the panic of someone watching their empire crumble in real time. The camera crew continued filming as he attempted to orchestrate a cover-up that would require silencing African laboratories, bribing international media, and somehow making genetic evidence disappear from scientific databases. His usual confidence had been replaced by the manic energy of a cornered animal, pacing the presidential office while barking orders to subordinates across multiple time zones. Traore watched this performance with the calm detachment of someone who had anticipated every desperate move his opponent might attempt in these crucial moments. The DNA evidence lay spread across the mahogany table, like an indictment that no amount of money or influence could alter, scientific truth immune to political manipulation. Outside, the evening call to prayer provided a spiritual soundtrack to Trump's moral collapse. African voices rising in harmony, while American power revealed its hollow foundation. The phone calls multiplied as Trump's panic intensified, each conversation revealing the vast machinery of deception that had protected powerful men from inconvenient truths throughout American history. His voice cracked as he offered increasingly desperate bribes, millions of dollars to laboratory technicians, media ownership stakes to news executives, and political favors to anyone who might help suppress genetic evidence that threatened his carefully constructed identity. The irony wasn't lost on the camera operators who captured every word of his attempted corruption, documenting how American democracy's supposed champion was willing to destroy scientific institutions to protect his racial mythology. Traoré's aide quietly informed him that similar offers were being made to African journalists, researchers, and government officials, confirming that Trump's desperation extended across continents. The young captain's expression remained unchanged as he listened to Trump's increasingly frantic attempts to purchase silence from people who had waited generations for this moment of truth. His grandmother's stories had taught him that justice delayed is not justice denied, and no amount of American money could buy back dignity that had been stolen but never truly lost. The cameras rolled relentlessly, preserving evidence of corruption that would add criminal conspiracy charges to the cultural devastation Trump already faced. The cover-up operation revealed the extent of institutional rot that had protected American racial mythology from scientific scrutiny for decades, with Trump's calls exposing networks of complicit journalists, corrupted academics, and purchased politicians. His attempts to pressure the Burkinabe government included threats of economic sanctions, military intervention, and diplomatic isolation if the DNA evidence was released to international media. The phone conversations captured on audio revealed how many previous scandals had been buried through similar tactics, suggesting that Trump's African ancestry might not be the only genetic secret that powerful families had hidden from public view. Traoré's security team monitored attempted cyber attacks on their government servers, confirming that digital warfare was being deployed alongside traditional bribery and intimidation to suppress the truth. The young leader's voice remained steady as he informed Trump that African sovereignty meant their evidence belonged to the continent, not to American interests seeking to control global narratives about race and identity. Each failed attempt at suppression only strengthened Traoré's resolve to expose how Western power had been built on lies that science could systematically destroy. The cameras documented every moment of this institutional corruption, creating evidence that would fuel investigations into American influence operations for years to come. The final desperate gambit involved Trump's attempt to discredit African laboratory capabilities, his voice rising to near hysteria as he claimed that primitive institutions couldn't produce reliable genetic analysis that would stand up to American scientific scrutiny. The racist condescension in his words provided perfect irony as he unknowingly insulted the very people whose blood flowed through his own veins, making his supremacist rhetoric a form of genetic self-hatred that psychiatrists would study for decades. His phone calls revealed coordination with European allies who were equally threatened by the implications of genetic evidence undermining racial categories that justified their own colonial legacies. The attempted cover-up included plans to flood social media with disinformation about DNA testing reliability, fund fake research contradicting the African findings, and deploy bot networks to discredit any journalist who reported on the story. Traoré listened to these machinations with the patience of someone whose ancestors had survived much worse attempts at cultural erasure, his calm demeanor contrasting sharply with Trump's panicked flailing. The irony reached its peak as Trump spent his final moments of credibility trying to silence the very genetic truth that connected him to the continent he had spent decades disparaging through policy and rhetoric. The cameras captured it all: corruption, racism, and desperation, combining to create a perfect storm of American moral bankruptcy exposed by African dignity and scientific precision. The inevitable moment arrived as Traoré's thumb pressed the send button, releasing genetic truth across digital networks that no amount of American influence could control or contain. Within seconds, newsrooms in Lagos, Accra, Dakar, and Cairo received simultaneous transmissions of DNA evidence that would rewrite textbooks about race, power, and the artificial hierarchies that had shaped centuries of human suffering. The footage of Trump's breakdown accompanied scientific documentation that made denial impossible, creating a multimedia exposure that reached every corner of the globe before his damage control teams could even organize their response. Al Jazeera's breaking news alert flashed across millions of screens. DNA evidence proves Trump's African ancestry. Exclusive footage shows complete breakdown. The BBC Africa service followed immediately with comprehensive analysis, linking the revelation to broader questions about American racial mythology and its impact on global politics throughout the post-colonial era. Trump's desperate attempts at suppression had failed completely, his phone calls to media executives proving useless against African journalists who answered to continental dignity rather than Western financial pressure. The truth had achieved escape velocity, beyond the gravitational pull of American corruption and European complicity in maintaining racist narratives that genetic science was systematically destroying. The global reaction exploded across social media platforms as millions of users shared, commented, and memed the devastating irony of America's most prominent white supremacist being exposed as genetically African. Twitter hashtags Trump, is African, and DNA don't lie trended worldwide within hours, accompanied by videos of Trump's breakdown that became the most watched political footage in internet history. Academic institutions scrambled to respond as genetic evidence forced immediate revisions to curricula that had perpetuated racial myths now proven scientifically impossible. The revelation inspired celebration across the African diaspora, with descendants of enslaved people finding vindication in seeing their oppressor's ideology destroyed by the very genetic heritage he had denied and despised. University students from Johannesburg to Atlanta organized demonstrations celebrating African scientific institutions that had preserved truth, while Western academia had promoted lies about racial hierarchy and genetic superiority. The footage became required viewing in schools across 3 continents, teaching children that colonialism's racial categories were political fictions designed to justify economic exploitation rather than biological realities. Museums worldwide faced immediate pressure to return African artifacts, unable to maintain that colonial theft was justified when their closest allies were revealed to be African descendants themselves. The scientific community embraced the revelation as vindication of genetic research that had long contradicted racial mythologies, with researchers publishing papers about how this case demonstrated the artificial nature of categories used to justify centuries of human oppression. International courts began accepting genetic evidence in reparations cases, using Trump's African ancestry as precedent for claims that colonial powers had stolen from their own genetic relatives through systematic violence and cultural erasure. The revelation strengthened indigenous movements globally, proving that DNA analysis could support land claims and cultural rights that governments had previously dismissed as lacking scientific foundation. African governments immediately leveraged the footage in United Nations forums, arguing that continued economic exploitation of the continent constituted genetic self-hatred by Western powers whose leaders carried hidden African heritage. The case inspired new scholarship, examining how many other prominent figures might carry suppressed African ancestry, threatening to unravel the entire intellectual foundation of white supremacist ideology that had shaped global politics since the Atlantic slave trade began. Climate change negotiations shifted dramatically as African nations gained unprecedented moral authority to demand reparations from countries whose racial mythology had been exposed as genetically impossible. The moment marked the beginning of Africa's intellectual renaissance, as traditional knowledge systems that had preserved genetic truths gained international recognition that Western science was only beginning to appreciate. The lasting impact resonated through every aspect of global culture, as Trump's genetic revelation became a watershed moment that divided history into before and after the lies of race were scientifically destroyed. Children growing up in this new era would learn that human genetic diversity made racial hierarchies biologically meaningless, using Trump's African ancestry as the definitive case study in how colonialism had built political categories on foundations of scientific impossibility. The footage would be preserved in digital archives as evidence of the moment when African dignity triumphed over Western supremacy through the undeniable power of genetic truth and scientific precision. Traoré's strategic revelation had accomplished more than personal vindication. It had provided the global South with intellectual ammunition to challenge every assumption about power, race, and belonging that had justified centuries of exploitation and cultural destruction. The Red Earth of Burkina Faso had reclaimed one of its scattered children, proving that no amount of political power could sever genetic connections that bound all humanity to the African motherland. Future generations would study this moment as the turning point when colonialism's greatest lie, racial superiority, finally met its match in the form of science, dignity, and the courage of African leaders who refused to let truth remain buried. The cameras had captured not just Trump's breakdown, but the precise instant when the mythology of white supremacy collapsed under the weight of genetic evidence that connected all human beings to their shared African origin, making racism a form of species-wide self-hatred that no rational society could continue to tolerate. The truth revealed in that Ouagadougou palace changed everything, proving that DNA doesn't recognize the lies we tell ourselves about race and superiority. What's your take on this genetic bombshell that shattered decades of carefully constructed mythology? Subscribe for more revelations that challenge everything you thought you knew, and drop your thoughts in the comments below.